Hello, my name is Richard Smith, and welcome to this tutorial, which is for sculpting fabric and clothing on a character, focusing on the creases and folds and the details that make a piece of fabric look believable and ultimately look real. So first of all, a little bit about me. I'm a character artist in the games industry, and I've been making characters for games for 5 years now. And ZBrush3 has really become one of the main tools I use in my day-to-day job since the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 generation of games came along. So in this demo, I'm going to be looking at this static posed character. It's nice to work on a static character because you don't have to worry about how it's going to animate, and therefore how all the creases and the folds you've made are going to deform under animation. You can purely use all that to really sell the pose and complement the way the model's standing. So I'm going to focus on the processes I use to build part of this posed model. I'm going to look at the brushes and the various bits and bobs in ZBrush that I find useful. But first of all, I'm going to look at some reference material. I'm a big believer that it's really important to have a good stash of reference material that you can look at while you're modeling. So first of all, let's take a look at that. Okay, so I've gathered together some reference material here of the kind of stuff I'd usually be looking at when I'm working on a piece of fabric. Can't stress the importance enough of having loads of decent photo reference. It really helps because it's a good point of reference to look at and even copy from, if need be, when you're sculpting your fabric and the folds. And actually also studying it helps you understand the behavior of the cloth and how it reacts to the underlying forms of the body. So, I mean, this photo is particularly relevant because it's a similar pose to the kind of thing I'm working with in this sculpt. And things to look for here are the way that the fabric sort of tucks under the arm and makes these nice radiating folds out under the shoulder, and also how this waistband sort of draws the fabric in from the bagginess around the back. And the folds sort of radiate out towards the shoulder blade where you've got this flatter area, and then they tuck into a kind of tighter crease as the fabric's compressed around the waist. And it's also worth bearing in mind what the fabric actually is and the properties of it, because this is a kind of thin cotton material, I assume, which lends itself to tighter, crisper creases. And that's something to bear in mind when you're modeling your fabric. You really want to think about what it's made of and how it'll actually behave. So in this image, I'm really interested in this pattern here, this crisscrossing effect, which is something you tend to see quite a lot when you've got a baggy mass of fabric that's been bunched up together. And in this case, this sort of, obviously the guy's leg is in there and it's being pulled across that surface. So we're getting these sort of flattened areas surrounded by this crisscross. And it's almost like the fabric's sort of being pulled away. It really gives a sense of sort of realism if you can replicate that in your 3D sculpt. And in this case, we've got a similar sort of situation to the crisscrossing effect, where this sleeve's been drawn up the model's arm here. And it's much tighter in that it's almost become like a concertina effect, where the leather here is sort of bunched into this backwards and forwards wave pattern. And what I find is worth looking at here is the way that you've got wider sections which lead into tighter sections in the corner and then back out into wider sections again. Okay, another example of a pair of trousers here that I want to look at. And what I really want to show here is that a pair of trousers does not just hang like a couple of tubes. Even if it is quite loose, you always tend to get, well, I suppose it depends on the cut of the fabric, but in this case we've got this central pleat which runs down the center, and that tends to bring about, you know, a certain crease down the middle. And it's interesting the way this sort of zigzags down the leg and the sort of folds it creates around it. You almost get sort of planar triangular areas around on either side of this crease. And that's definitely something to think about. Here we've got a big one that's sort of there, and again, a larger area of flatness sort of up the lower leg here. And these are all things to sort of look at and try and work in, if need be, into your model. It's also really interesting the way where you've got the valley in the crease here, the way it tightens on the corner of this crease and really sort of pulls it together. So I also think it's definitely worth looking at traditional sculpture and how old masters handled the treatment of fabric in their works. So this is a close-up of one of Bernini's works, and what I really like about this is the interaction with the hand here and this massive flowing dynamic fabric and the way that it all kind of hangs and folds together and repeats back on itself here. And we've got the tight corners which flow into these wider areas and then back into the tight corners and then out into this billowing, undulating drapery all down here. And I think what's important to bear in mind here is the way he used it to add this sort of flow and dynamism to it, and that kind of really helps sell the pose. And I find that that's really helpful to have in the back of my mind as I'm modelling, because I should always be thinking, like, how is this fold contributing to the whole effect of the model? It might sound a bit daft, but I think that helps. And again, in this piece, it's really the interaction between the figure and the fabric that's key, the way the weight of this hand is forcing down this drapery around this chap's neck. And as it does so, it's creating deeper folds and more folds under the area of pressure. And this is something I particularly want to focus on here, is how one crease can branch off into two more creases. And that's an interesting pattern that you get, like the crisscrossing effect, that tends to crop up quite a lot in folding fabric. So that's another one to bear in mind in particular when we get back to sculpting the model. Okay, here we are in ZBrush, and this is our basic posed naked mannequin that we're going to be clothing. So I'm going to bring in the jacket base mesh. Now this is something I've modelled in Maya very simply, concentrating mostly on the topology of the geometry. You'll notice that I've got some beveled edges in there for where I know the edges are going to be, but apart from that, it's just basically a quadded, gridded mesh, just to keep things nice and simple and avoid as many artifacts as possible. So I'm going to append that to the main body mesh and try to position it as closely as I can to where it needs to be using transpose. So I'm just rotating that into place there. It's obviously a very basic shape at the moment, so it just has to be roughly in place, and we're going to refine all that later on. So, smoothing it up, give it a little bit more definition. Important thing to note at this point is I've creased the edges of the mesh so that when it's smoothed, the edges don't get pulled out of shape. And here I'm just using the move brush to rough out the general shape of the thing, hide part of the model so that my pivot's more in the center, makes it easier to rotate around. And I've got the transparency turned on so that I can see through the jacket mesh to the body mesh, so I've got some idea of where I'm pulling things to. And at this stage I'm just really roughing things out, not trying to be precise at all, just to get the geometry covering the body. Don't need to pay too much attention to accuracy really at this stage. Now, what I've done with this is I've set it up in Maya so that the UVs for the sleeves and each side of the jacket are in different squares in the 0 to 1 space. So the advantage of that is when it comes into ZBrush, I can just click the UV groups button in the polygroups menu, and that allows me to quickly switch between each part of the jacket so that I can mask off certain bits I don't want or hide them all together. And as you can see at this point, I'm using the transpose tool again, just on a certain part of it to isolate the flap that will eventually be one side of the jacket. Again, masking off the bit I don't want so that I don't interfere with the geometry I've just moved. And moving bits around with the move tool again. Just hide that flap underneath there. Now at this point I'm going to start moving the sleeves into position. Again using transpose, really powerful tool. It effectively gives you the power to start with an incredibly simple base mesh as we have here. I sometimes just start making heads out of cubes and whole bodies just out of cuboids with bits sticking off them, and then use the transpose to manipulate things into place. And then smooth that out. Again, isolate the bit I want, so I don't mess up the torso area. And just roughly pushing and pulling things into place. Again, looking through the mesh so that I can see where the arm actually is. It's useful to have the body underneath so that I don't get carried away moving the jacket around, and I don't need to worry about maintaining the anatomy of the character because it's there for me to see underneath the mesh. And just roughly feeling out the volumes of the fabric here. Not worrying at all at this point about where any creases or folds or anything is going to go. And just shorten that sleeve into place. I'm effectively modelling in ZBrush here. Really the mesh that we create in Maya is purely for the sake of the topology. You could almost create the same thing using Z-spheres, I guess, but I just find it easier to bring it in from somewhere else. Moving on to the other side. Same technique again. Set up a mask, insert the action line, and just roughly drag it into place. Shorten it up to the elbow, where I want it to be. And I definitely prefer to bring in as simple a shape I can as my base mesh, and then do all the sculpting in ZBrush rather than kind of rough out a general shape of what I want in Maya and then pick it up in ZBrush and have to work with it from there. I find if I start with something incredibly basic in ZBrush and do the whole job inside ZBrush, then I just get a better result. I guess it's because it's easier to run with the model from the very beginning, and that makes a more organic process as you sculpt, rather than starting the model with polygon tools and modeling the traditional way and then switching to sculpting halfway through, something like that. So kind of getting to the point where I've got the majority of the jacket in place now, sort of covering up the majority of the flesh. Just pull that flap in into the right place. Looking around from all sides. It's looking pretty good. The collar up there, where that will eventually meet on the final model. I've got a bigger collar that comes up to the head. But the garment's composed of quite a few various pieces. This is one part of it. And I keep tabbing in and out of full screen mode here if you're wondering why the menus keep appearing and disappearing. I just like to make the most use of the screen space I've got. Refining the shape a little bit at this stage. Not worrying too much, we're still quite at a low res here, so I'm pulling that flap in again. Flatten out a little bit, and move back again. You've got to not be worried about obliterating all the work you've done and just starting again at this stage, because it should be so quick and fluid that it doesn't really matter if you have to go back and try the whole thing again. It's all a case of trial and error, I guess. So nothing very special going on here. Just really transpose and simple brush to push and pull and get things roughly in the right place. Have a quick look around and ready to divide and go up to the next level. Move around again just a little bit to fix that up. And at this stage I like to use the flattened brush as opposed to the simple brush to rough out my major shapes. I guess it's just a personal preference really why I use the flattened brush. I'll just save a quick version here. I think with the flattened brush it helps you just block out shapes more easily because you get that nice square flattened off surface when you make a stroke. I use it on quite a high setting, about 30 in the brush mod slider, to sort of punch it out as opposed to just flatten it down. And we're building in some of the main volumes in the sleeve here where the cloth will puff out as it comes down to the elbow. And then the fabric's drawn in around the tighter elasticated bit that grips the elbow there. And here I'm gouging in where one of the major folds in that sleeve is going to be. So concentrate first of all on the major forms before we move into the more delicate and intricate bits later on. It's really a case of blocking out the important details first. I say details, I guess these are major features really. Get that all working, and when it does, then we can move in and concentrate on the finer bits. I'm also trying at this stage not to zoom in too far. I'm trying to keep a fair distance from the model, because it's nice to get things working at a glance from a distance before we move in closer. And that's looking basically right. I'm not worried too much at this stage about getting it entirely accurate, because at any point I could decide it all looks wrong and want to start again. So just fleshing out how that crease will come around from the back of the arm and across the back there. She is kind of holding her shoulder back, so there will be some creasing under and behind the arm there. Checking at a glance from a distance. And how the cloth will stretch across the chest. I think there's going to be some kind of clasp or fastening device in the corner of that flap there. So that section of cloth that passes across the chest will be under some kind of tension, and we can help sell that by having these long, stretched crease bits that go across the width of her body there. And I really don't want to lose the shape of the breasts on the model, because that's part of what makes it also sexy. So we're going to try and show that through the fabric and have the fabric stretching and creasing around it, as opposed to hiding the whole form of the anatomy completely with the jacket. And moving on to the other side. Creases under the arm there. And what we want to think about here is, if the model was in, say, a T-pose, and the fabric was just draped over the model, think about how it would look then, and then how the fabric would change if she was to drop her arms down. So, from a relaxed position to a posed position, how the behavior of the fabric is going to change, and what's actually going to happen is you're going to get a lot more creasing under the arms. So what I'm thinking about here is, how much volume of material is there at this particular part of the model, and how is it going to react to the way the model's posed? You know, is it going to be tight, or is it going to be baggy? Is it going to be stretched around a form, or is there going to be an excess of material that's just hanging there? I suppose in the underarm area, there's going to be a lot of material that's bunched up because it's being crushed between her arm and her body, and over the top of the shoulder it's going to be stretched more taut because her arm is pulling the weight of that fabric down. So all of these things are worth bearing in mind. You know, how tight is the fabric, what's it made of, and how are all these things going to affect how it hangs. And even if a character's arms and legs are straight in the pose you're working on, the fabric at the elbows, say, and well, at the knees if you're working on the full body, will still probably be wrinkled, because they're the areas which see a lot of movement in the character. So even though the character's static, you can indicate this, and it gives the whole thing that much more life, because you're giving it a believability that it isn't just a static pose, but it's a moving person that has been captured in that pose. And it all helps sell the overall effect. And I also think it's important to consider the direction of the creases. So if the elbow bends in one direction, then the creases are going to be perpendicular to that motion. So we've got folds and creases going across the width of the arm. Now at this stage I've just brought in part of the corset geometry, piece I made earlier. So what I'm trying to do here is work in how the jacket is going to fold and be constrained underneath this corset piece. So it just helps to have that in place there. It's really going to tuck in under that surface. And rather than just guess where it goes, it's helpful to have a piece. And this is generally how I work when I'm building up a clothed character like this. I'll start with the naked mesh of the whole body, and then bring in bits of geometry one at a time, depending on where I think a separate piece of geometry is needed. So the finished thing will probably be made of many, many subtools, one for each separate part. I'm trying to think here about how the folds will radiate out from underneath this corset, which is a tighter garment, and we've got the baggier jacket, so it's going to be drawing in the fabric underneath it and causing the fabric of the jacket to be compressed and pinched together. We also really want to be considering, although not too much at this stage because we're still at quite a low res, but the effects of how gravity is going to influence the behavior of the fabric. Because the fabric is going to be pulled down by the effects of gravity, and we're going to see, a little bit of curvature in horizontal creases as they're pulled down under their own weight. At this point, I'm just creasing out the edges of this flap using the pinch brush, just to give that a bit more definition that I've lost through smoothing it out. Hide the head to get that out of the way. Tidy up under there where that little bit of sticking through there. And build it back up with the standard brush there and just pinch it out again to reinforce that edge. I like to use the pinch brush with lazy mouse on because it helps give that straighter line. And using the move brush again, just viewing the model as a whole, trying to assess overall shapes and the silhouette, and push and pull things roughly into a more accurate place of where I want them. Just going back in and reworking that bit, not looking like it's going to work out, so change it a little bit. And at this point it's looking okay, we're probably about ready to move it to the next subdivision level, I guess. A little bit more messing around there. Thinking about how I can make it more dynamic at this stage, really, I guess. Just by pulling that bit in, just makes it look like it's stretched that much more over the breast area. And tucking the front under the corset again. Really just using the move brush to translate the geometry around and then smooth out with the standard brush. A bit poking through, just get rid of that. What you can't see doesn't matter. Let's save another quick version. And we're ready to divide. Okay, so now we get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty detail. So I'm going to start by just smoothing the surface out a bit to help refamiliarize myself with the general forms there. That's something I always try and make myself do after having watched Zach Petrock's body sculpture series, just to always, after dividing the mesh, go back in with the smooth brush and just make one pass over the whole of the area, not only just to refamiliarize myself with the forms, but it also helps reduce that kind of bumpy blobbiness as much as I can. I'm trying at this stage as much as possible to avoid that kind of lumpy blancmange effect on the surface by constantly going back to the smooth brush when I'm not happy with how a shape's working and just smoothing out and effectively starting again, really. I'm using quite a small radius of the brush there to get some quite tight creases in. And looking at it from the side, because it's easy to get lost in what it looks like from one angle, but then you go and look at it from the side and realize that you've got higher bits at one point and lower recesses at another, and nothing quite lines up. So it's useful to keep looking at it from different angles, I find. And now we're getting into the tighter detail. It's worth considering like what this jacket is actually supposed to be made of and how that fabric is going to behave. So I'm thinking in my head here that this is kind of made of a sort of a thicker canvasy kind of material. So it's not really thin cotton that's going to crease into incredibly fine little creases, and it's not like thick duffel coat that's going to make big chunky volumes of crease. It's somewhere in the middle there. So try and bear that in mind. I mean, it's worth thinking about how much the fabric weighs, I guess, and the thickness of it, because all of these things are going to influence the behavior of the cloth. And if you can work that in across the garment as a whole, it will give it a more consistent feel, I guess, because you won't have one area that actually looks like it might be made of something and another that looks like something else. It's a very subtle thing, but I guess the devil's in the detail. So I find all these things are worth thinking about while I'm working on it. And we're just digging in some recesses here in between the curves and pulling out the raised bits where the definition's got lost in the smoothing. I'm trying to work in a few more of the dynamic sweeping creases here as well. Nice bit of curvature in there. Tightening up the corners of where that fabric folds and doubles back on itself. Remembering that Bernini reference. I've actually got, on a different monitor here, loads of pictures open that I keep referring back to. So, always got something to look at while I'm working. I'm not just making all the stuff out of my head, as much as I wish I could. And smoothing out again. I'm not entirely happy with how that back's working at the moment. So. I'm trying to approach the whole model as a whole, not getting overly bogged down with one particular area at this point. Try and consider how the whole thing hangs together, rather than focusing too much on one area. So, moving around the model. Just punch out that crease down the back of the left arm there. And I guess what I'm trying to do here is maintain the surface area of the cloth. And I'm trying to think that if all the creases were smoothed out, imagine this jacket was laid out flat on a table, or even think about the pattern of the jacket before it was actually sewed together. We would be having like square or rectangular panels here that are of, they have square edges of equal length, etc. So we've got to kind of bear that in mind because we're trying to maintain those surface areas even though it's all creased up. Now what I'm trying to say here is that you don't want a huge area of creases on one side of the model and hardly any just around the corner, because that will look wrong, because if that were to be stretched out, it would make it look like a warped area of fabric. And what we're trying to do is give this some believability by making it look like this is a jacket that actually fits, but it's just been creased because of the way the model's standing. So if this sleeve's going to be hitched up around her elbow like this, then there's going to be a greater volume of creasing. But if it was rolled down, it should look like a normal sleeve, and these folds would even out to make, like, I don't know, I guess a perfect tube. I hope that makes sense. It's quite difficult to explain, but that's what I'm trying to think about here. So I'm just accentuating that main crease that comes down the front of that arm. I'm thinking about if the elbow was to bend there, what would happen? It's almost like she has just bent her elbow, and that's given it that crease across where the elbow section is. Obviously, the upper arm has no bend in it, because that is, that's one bone, so there are going to be no kind of radial creases around that section of the arm, as much as there would be around the elbow. So we've got that large diagonal crease coming down the forearm there. Now, you don't necessarily have to understand, the precise properties of a piece of fabric. I don't pretend to. A lot of this stuff you can do just as well just by looking at a photo of something in a similar pose and trying to effectively work in what you can see there without necessarily really considering what's going on at all. And we're pinching in under where that excess of fabric is hanging there. Smooth out and rework. And build in the tight corners of that crease. And onto the front of the arm. Smooth out first of all. It's probably worth mentioning the shader I'm using here on the model, this pink skin kind of shader. It has a nice specular property to it, which helps read the surface detail. It gives you a good idea of where the raised bits and the recesses are, as opposed to a matte material. Building some of the small creased areas there. Loop that around. Trying to make the creases that work on each side of the sleeve work together by flowing around from the front to the back. So it's almost like the crease wraps around the radius of the arm. And again, we're building up and then smoothing out and pinching in around the inside there. And I'm just noodling away at this point. The main areas are basically roughed in, so it's just a case of working into those areas, picking out the details, and making sure it all looks nice. Just give that shoulder a bit of definition. So we've got some creases radiating out from the underarm, which reinforces that impression that as the arm has come down, it's drawn in the fabric around it, and it'll be stretched out more across the top of the shoulder, and there'll be this excess of fabric underneath the underarm there, where the cloth is folded. And working from the back across the top of the shoulder, again considering all sides of what's going on there. Just leave that for a second as we concentrate back on the front. Digging in, pulling out. Give that a little bit more definition. A bit of a tighter crease there. Just considering how the weight of the breasts will rest on top of that corset area and what's going to happen underneath there with a little bit of fabric that's hanging over the edge and then tucking in underneath. And how that stretches around the spherical form without interfering too much with the shape of the breast. You don't want to mess with that at all. Now on this side it's kind of stretching out to accommodate the volume of the breast. So what we've got here really is a kind of baggy, hitched up effect around the arms on the sleeves. Between the shoulder blades there's a sort of horizontally compressed mass of baggy fabric as the shoulders have been sort of drawn back, and across the chest is the opposite, where the fabric has sort of been stretched out horizontally. So we've got these long horizontal creases across the breadth of the chest, and vertical kind of bunching up of the fabric across the back. So really it just takes a little bit of consideration, I guess, of how the pose of the character is affecting the behaviour of the cloth, as opposed to just, not thinking about it at all and lumping in any old creases. And that tends to be how you end up with the kind of "Sculpting effect," as I like to call it. And here I'm just using the move brush to tweak out where these curves are going to fit together here. Other than sculpting, I tend to, without really wanting to, I end up with straight lines, and it's nice to go in with the move brush and just round things out a little bit more. It's nice and easy to do. It doesn't particularly matter about how you're affecting the topology at this stage, so it's quite okay to just tweak things. And this is all like a massively important technique for the games side of things that I'm working on at the moment, because it's often the case that you're working on a character where you say you got, 100 polygons or so in the game to spend on the torso area, but that character needs to look like they're wearing some nice dynamic cloth object, so all of that detail really has to go into the normal map as opposed to the actual geometry. So we'd need to work something like this in ZBrush and then bake it onto the game geometry. So to be able to come up with some decent surface detail is kind of great importance to making that character work well. It's all about the normal maps. And again, not quite happy with that area there, so I've just smoothed out, and now I'm going back in, messing around with subtle master there, not really doing what I want. I want to hide the rest of it, so I've just got that on the screen on its own. The problem I was having there was I was getting a bit too much geometry on the screen, so it was affecting the way the stroke was being laid down. So I tend to turn the stroke average up to maximum anyway, just to give me the smoothest curves possible. But sometimes you need to hide the rest of the model just to get your machine running that bit faster. And pinching the corner there. Get that nice tight curve as the fold doubles back on itself. And we're working with a little bit of that crisscross effect there, even though it's been kind of compressed down. Back in with the pinch brush, just to draw the surfaces together to add that extra little bit of definition where the recesses are. And to square off the edges of the raised bits as well. It just tend to make the raised creases look that much more dynamic if they have a little bit of a square edge to them, I find. Working around the whole model as a whole. Again, even at this stage, not getting bogged down too much with one particular area on its own, but I always like to zoom out and look at the whole thing all together so that you can see how the whole thing hangs together. And pinching around the corners and in the tight recesses of these curves on the back here. Lay in that valley. Those two large creases come together there. I tend to work on one area until I feel like I've been looking at it for too long, and then go around and do another bit on another area of the model, and then come back to it later with a fresh pair of eyes and see how it all went wrong the first time, and end up starting again with it. Again, just digging in finer recesses of that sleeve. There's quite a lot of messy curves and crumpling up going on in that underarm region there. Just kind of hinting at how all that works. I'm not going to get too bogged down in the detail. It'd be quite easy to go in there with a pinch brush and round out and tighten up all of those curves, but I think doing that would make that area too noodly and messy. So just leave it a little bit more suggestive. It's good to keep kind of the same level of detail across the whole model, rather than concentrating too much on one bit and not so much on another, because it would sort of knock the whole thing off balance. I'd rather spread an even amount of attention across the whole model. Looking at the whole model as a whole here. Turn the other various bits and bobs back on so we can see how it works in conjunction with the body. You can see how we've just got a bit poking through there as had the body turned off. Couldn't see where that was, so it's useful to bring it back in and just tweak. So hopefully this has given you some idea of how I work. I would probably continue just noodling away and working into the details more and more, getting down to a really fine level to the point where I'm basically just happy with the result. So I might go in and divide once or twice more, or not, depending on how it's looking, but I won't bore you with the extra fine details. I'm going to skip forward now to one I prepared earlier. And you can see how I've got all the various different subtools here inserted. So effectively, all I do is repeat the same process with different little bits of geometry that I bring in, and keep layering it all up and adding more, and that kind of helps build up the whole effect of the model. So as you can see, as I turn a few bits and bobs off here, that's sort of how the whole model's built up. And there we have it. Voila! So thanks for watching.